Welcome to this episode of the Autism Annex podcast. I'm John Andrew Slominski. My guest today is Dr. Temple Grandin. Dr. Grandin is a professor of animal science at Colorado State University, and she has written and spoken prolifically about animal behavior, autism, and the ways in which different types of brains navigate the world. She has appeared on 2020, the BBC, Primetime, and was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people. The 2010 film about her life won several Emmys, a Golden Globe, and a Peabody Award, and introduced millions of people to Dr. Grandin's remarkable life for the first time. I was among those people about 14 years ago, and it's a great honor to have you on the podcast today. Dr. Grandin, thanks so much for being here.
Well, it's great to be here.
You've done countless interviews over the years. Do you ever get tired of being introduced?
Well, I want to get information out to people.
You've been very influential in two spaces, both animal science and livestock management, and in shaping our cultural understanding of autism and neurodiversity. At first look, these might seem like unconnected worlds, but you've written about how your ways of thinking have made a natural connection between the two. Could you talk about where your interests overlap and how you've come to understand different types of autistic minds?
Well, I'm an object visualizer. Everything I think about is a picture. Now, I thought everybody thought in pictures until I was in my late 30s. But since I think in pictures rather than words, it was obvious to me in my very first cattle work to go in the chutes and see what cattle were seeing. And I noticed they'd stop at a reflection, at a shadow, chain hanging down, coat on a fence, stuff like this. They'd stop at. And other people hadn't thought about looking at what they were seeing. Other people thought it was weird to look at what cattle were seeing. Yes, but there is overlap because being an object visualizer helped me to be very good at designing equipment. Now, what it made me bad at, couldn't do algebra. Absolutely couldn't do algebra. But I worked with a lot of very highly skilled people who invented mechanical equipment, owned machine shops, couldn't do algebra either, but they invented all kinds of equipment. And one of the things I want to see is the skills get developed. Because you can have object visualizers like me, but another kind of autistic mind is a mathematical pattern visual spatial mind. They think in patterns. And there's scientific research to show that these different kinds of thinking exist, which I talked about in my visual thinking book. And they're very good at computer programming, more traditional engineering with needs mathematics. And then there's a third type of autistic. They're I call them a word fact thinker. They'll know all the facts about some historical figure or about some sports teams. Whatever they're interested in, they're very, very good with verbal facts.
Right.
And I want to see these individuals, when they grow up, get into good jobs. The other big problem we got with autism is you're going all the way from Einstein at one end of the spectrum with no language till age 3 to somebody that might have no speech, and that also gets called autism. So you have this huge spectrum. And what I'm seeing today, especially on the fully verbal end, is I'm seeing too many kids not making the transition into work, not learning skills like shopping and ordering food in restaurants, just not getting learning life skills. And then I was in industry. I was in heavy construction for 25 years, and I worked with 2 shops where they were definitely autistic, undiagnosed, and they owned big shops. And then I go over to the autism meeting, and I find out there's an 18-year-old that needs to learn how to do welding, and they won't let him take welding because he's in special ed. Well, in my generation, special ed owned the shops. And this is the thing that frustrated me, is I go back and forth between the two fields. And I make a point in my conferences. I want to do some autism conferences, but I also jump at the chance to do industrial conferences, too.
I want to ask you more about your thoughts on early childhood in a moment. But let's stick with young adults in transition.
All right, let's work on the adult stuff, because that's where we've got some of the biggest problems. Because where they have good early childhood programs, things are great. But there are some parts of the country, especially in some of the rural areas, where 2-year-olds are being put on a 2-year wait list. That is not acceptable. And we all know you need to start early intervention early. But in the places where they do have decent programs, we're doing a much better job with the little kids than we are with getting the more older kids transferring into living by themselves in the world of work.
And that's the place where they're likely to fall off the so-called services cliff.
That's right.
So what should we be doing to make sure kids have the skills to be independent once they age out of services?
What we need to get them, we've got to do is make a transition into work before they age out. We need to start working on chores when kids are little. A lot of well-known, successful people that are autistic that worked in business, they had paper routes and they sold papers when they were 11 years old. So they learned entrepreneur skills. They learned working skills. We need to find substitutes for that, like church volunteer jobs, help out at the farmer's market, where they're working for somebody outside the home.
And it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, right?
Yes.
I mean, it stands to reason that if different minds think and conceptualize and work differently, they probably need different things, as well as having different kinds of strengths.
Well, for my kind of mind, we can't do algebra. So don't keep pounding away on algebra. I think some people think you have to have algebra for thinking. That's not how I think. A visual thinker just sees the solution to a problem. It comes up like a picture. And I'm saying I think they need to be putting all the hands-on classes back at the schools. And we need to be exposing kids early to lots and lots of different things. Because I'm seeing too many individuals just get addicted to video games. 10 hours a day of video games is not very helpful. And one of the ways you can get them off of that, and that's been very successful in Denver, is a program called TACT, Teaching Autistic Citizens Trades. And they gradually wean young adults off of video games and teach them how to fix cars. And they find out that motors are more interesting than video games. And then they place them in a car dealership and have a job coach there for another 2 months. And that's worked out really well. See, the best kinds of transitions are gradual. So you're gradually learning work skills, starting with the jobs at 11 years old. I was given a book up in Montana, a wonderful, super interesting little book about famous copper miners and silver miners. And one of them was a stutterer. And he was running a silver mine while he was selling papers when he was a child. You see, that taught that entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
That's really helpful. He'd probably be a special ed kid today.
I think it's safe to say, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you are relentlessly optimistic and encouraging when it comes to autistic and neurodiverse kids and their abilities. Where other people might focus on limitations, you see possibilities, and you focus on strengths.
And we need their skills. I travel all around the country. I'm finding broken elevators and broken escalators everywhere I go. In one of the rural states, they only had 2 elevator technicians for the whole state. I learned that just a week ago. The people that I worked with, when I spent 25 years in heavy construction, 70s, 80s, and 90s, I worked with people that are retired out now. They are not getting replaced. The little shops are not forming and turn into big shops. And we need these skills. We have infrastructure falling apart. And then we need the mathematicians. We're not developing our math kids either. I'm hearing story after story of little elementary school kids bored stiff with baby math because they aren't moving them ahead. And then they get bored and they do bad stuff because they're bored. Well, I'd like to get little math kids fixated on data centers. Yes, and this is what you're going to do. Look at all the electric power this data center takes. I want you to design computer circuits that will run on half the power and do the same thing. That's the kind of thing I want a brilliant math kid obsessed with, because he'll grow up and actually do it.
So clearly we have a long way to go in supporting teenagers and young adults and providing those opportunities for the math kids and the visual thinkers. But do you think there are places where we're getting it right?
I think one of the things that's been done right is the early education programs. Some of those are really done right. Now, I'm glad that ABA now has made a lot of progress on the little kids programs, but I think sometimes the autistic label is holding the teenagers back, because I'm seeing too much where they're becoming the label and they're not learning basic things, like driving, for example. If I hadn't learned to drive, I would not have been in the cattle industry. So that's simple, because that was all in rural areas. It's going to take a whole lot longer to learn to drive. More practice in a totally safe place. I started out in the middle of a horse pasture on a manual transmission. I'll even show you what I started out on. That's the truck I started out on right there. Squeezy toy truck from our credit union. I don't know why our credit union was giving those out, but they were. And then my aunt's mailbox was 3 miles away on a dirt road. So that gave me 6 miles of driving, 6 days a week in a very safe place on a dirt road. A lot more practice. Driver's ed crams them into it too quickly. Then they think they can do everything with simulators. I tried one of the simulators. I thought it was just terrible. And it didn't steer like a vehicle. It didn't steer right. And it said I failed. Well, I couldn't. The way the steering worked was not realistic at all. No, let's get a real car, and we're going to start out in the giant parking lot in the middle of it. Let's find one with no poles, nothing to hit. 20 minutes a day. Might spend a month, 20 minutes a day, driving around in that parking lot. And then gradually back roads, fields. You don't want to go out in mud holes in fields. But you've got to get a lot more practice. And it's going to require more practice than a neurotypical person.
Speaking of your childhood, you've been very open about how you grew up and some of the challenges you experienced. What were some of the lessons that you remember learning?
Well, being in the 50s, manners were taught in a much more structured way. There were a lot more expectations, but accommodations were made. And I did a lot of deep thinking about this, because last week I talked to a mom. Her 9-year-old pitched a big fit at the airport and wouldn't put his phone in the x-ray machine. That is something, that kind of problem would not have happened with me. But when we went on vacation, we went on this ferry boat with this horrible horn. And the first time it went off, I flung myself on the deck and I screamed. Then they let me ride in the cabin below. That was an accommodation. Yes, we are going on the ferry. And that was the last fit I threw on the ferry. You see, an accommodation was made. We could go to family gatherings. There was a room I could go into in the spare bedroom where I could go play with some toys to get my exercise on. They let me beat the elevator at my grandmother's apartment, and I could run up 5 flights of stairs faster than the elevator. And that kind of run the energy out of me. You see, that's an accommodation. But then on the other hand, I was expected to learn to eat properly with utensils. There was one little accommodation made, the way I held my fork, holding it like this, my finger on it. The meat ended up on the floor, so I held it in my fist, which is little, but then I could eat neatly. There was a little coordination problem there. I still hold it in my fist. Okay, that's a little accommodation. But there were expectations for doing normal stuff like going to a movie, going to family gatherings. And then manners were taught in a much more structured way. You were taught to shake hands. All the kids in our neighborhood, when you're 8 years old, you had to put your good clothes on and greet the guests. It was taught in a very much more structured way. And there was nothing mean about it. I wasn't forced to sit under that horn on the ferry. They let me go in the cabin down below. The other thing to prevent a lot of kinds of problems is no surprises. All right, let's get with the whole TSA thing. Well, let's watch the videos. Sometimes they have to touch people. You don't want to have that be a surprise. Let's look at videos of insides of airplanes. We can go out to the airport and watch them take off. Let's make it interesting without surprises. Surprises scare. That's just a real basic principle.
I know your mother was a huge advocate of yours when you were young. What kind of understanding do you think she had of how your brain worked?
I think Mother was a visual thinker.
Wow.
And neither of us knew that other people weren't visual thinkers. I remember talking to Mother 30 years ago, and we were discussing thinking, and she says, well, I thought everybody's a visual thinker. She was a very visual thinker. And I think that helped her on figuring out some of the accommodations. Because when I talk about riding in the cabin below in the ferry, I see the cabin. I can even feel the seat I sat on. And it had a window where you could slide down part of it.
The neurologist Oliver Sacks wrote a book in 1995 called An Anthropologist on Mars.
That's right.
Which is actually how you described yourself in the book.
That's right, because I said I had to figure out social skills like I was an anthropologist studying them. I have to figure them out. And autistic need really, really clear feedback when they're at work about social, mistakes they make. They end up getting a job and then they get fired because they're socially bad. But the bosses can't just say you're rude with colleagues. You need to give, when they do something rude, you need to be very specific as to what they did wrong. On my very first project, I criticized some welding and I said it looked like pigeon doo-doo. And the plant engineer pulled me into his office. I remember it really well, a little boiler room office. And he told me that I had to apologize. He didn't scream at me. He told me exactly what I had to do. That I had to apologize for that rude talk. Now, I didn't tell the welder the welding was wonderful, but I apologized for the rude talk. He told me exactly what to do, and he says, he's up in the cafeteria now, and you're going up there right now. Thank you, Harley. You're a great job, coach.
Well, and it sounds like Harley was both kind and empathetic, and also very clear in his feedback for you.
That was very helpful. And at the time, and especially as I've gotten older, and I'm looking back on these things, I realized what Harley did was just so important. He did it very calmly, and he explained to me exactly what I needed to do. And then I made sure I didn't do that again.
In your book, Animals in Translation, you write about the similarities between the minds of the animals you've studied and your own. What surprises you most about the minds of other humans?
Well, how illogical they are. I just can't believe some of the illogic. Okay, election, we don't even discuss that. No, I'm kind of horrified at just how illogical human beings can be. I can't believe some of the conspiracy theories people can believe. All right, I think this is safe to talk about. Airplane trails are a government plot. Well, just the other day, I watched, for some reason, the airplane trails were really low and you could see the airplanes. Usually you can't. I'm going, really? I was on a plane one time when this girl was showing all these dumb pictures on her phone, these ridiculous websites about airplane trails. And guess what? Southwest Airlines was whipping by outside the window with leaving an airplane trail. Yeah, that kind of nonsense. I just don't know how people can believe some of this nonsense.
Do you feel, in a way, that animals are more logical than human beings?
Well, animals, one thing, they're more predictable in how they think. I mean, like we did a very interesting experiment with horses where why does the horse sometimes spook for no reason? So we took a children's play set that has a little slide and a swing. They're about 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot, little toddler play set. Now think about it. This book was the slide. It looks different in this orientation than that orientation. So he walked horses by this thing like 15 times till they no longer stopped. They no longer did this. When that play set was rotated, it became a new object. Because the memory is a picture. I love that experiment.
And your findings make sense. And to bring it back to humans with autism, that seems to correlate with a couple of challenges that are typical for individuals on the spectrum, right? Namely, perspective taking and generalizing knowledge and skills when situations change, like the play structure that you're talking about in your study with the horses.
Well, when we walked them by it, we left it at the same orientation. They will walk by it 15 or 16 times at the same orientation. Then the play set was turned 90 degrees. So the slide then goes from this to that. See how different that looks? So just the slide on the play set would look very different.
Do you have animals at home?
No, I don't. I'm traveling 85% of the time now. I thought about getting a dog during COVID, and I said, well, then when I get back on the road after COVID, I live a very busy life. And at the age I'm at now, 77 years old, I want to see these kids that are different, that are different labels, grow up and have a good life, and we got to get them out doing things, and we do have to make some accommodations. On noise, okay, they didn't think the autistic kids could tolerate shop class. You know how you get them over the noise sensitivity? You give them an electric drill and say, you're turning it on and off. Here's some wood, here's some metal, now drill holes in it. You see, when they make the noise, when they turn it on, it's much better tolerated. You know what they should have done with me? They should have taken me up where the captain was, and when the ship comes into the harbor, they said, now you pull the cord. You see, when the autistic person initiates the sound, it's much better tolerated. You do that with vacuum cleaners, hair dryers. One family took their kid down to the fire station, and they let him turn on the siren. That made a difference. Now, I still have problems with hearing in noisy restaurants. This is where some socializing is really hard because I can't hear. I was at a party just the other day. We went to a really nice steakhouse, and I just kind of tuned out and was looking at stuff on the wall because there was just too much noise, and I couldn't hear what people were saying. And then I think maybe I've gotten older now. It's gotten somewhat worse. But
as a professor of animal science at Colorado State University, what are your classes like? I imagine you work with students of all different kinds of minds and experiences. What sorts of things do you do with them?
Well, I teach a class in livestock handling, and I get regular lecture on behavior. Then they have to do a scale drawing. And some say, well, why would you ever want to do a scale drawing? Well, let's say you're remodeling a house. I've got students today that have never used a ruler. Okay, if a cattle chutes 30 inches wide, they don't realize that 2 foot 6 inches is 30 inches. I am not kidding. This is recent stuff. And then I have them do another project where I teach them how to use scientific databases like Google Scholar, PubMed, Web of Science, and the Elsevier databases. Okay, maybe they won't believe so much garbage if they can look up science. You know, these databases access all the scientific literature, and all PubMed is medical and veterinary, but the others are everything. And PubMed and Google Scholar are free. You know, so you can look up. Okay, there was all those discussions about medicines for COVID. You better believe it. During COVID, I've spent hours online looking that stuff up. But it got gotten controversial, so I'm not going to tell you what I discovered, but I figured I could save my butt if I got COVID. And I was worried about it because I'm a senior. You better believe it. I was instant I could get the vaccine, I did. See, that's another example of the illogic.
You're a huge advocate for the skilled trades, and I want to ask you more about that.
Now, I'm really pushing the trades, and the reason why I'm pushing the trades is AI is going to knock out a lot of animation jobs, a lot of video game design jobs, and a lot of just run-of-the-mill illustrations. Then you have your visual spatial math pattern thinker. They think in patterns. They're going to be very good at the mathematical part of engineering. Let's take building a food processing plant. My kind of mind builds the mechanical equipment and invents it. The mathematicians need it for the refrigeration system. We don't understand refrigeration. We don't touch that stuff. That requires mathematics. So in order to make the whole factory, you've got to have both. And then you have another autistic that's a word fact thinker. Loving their favorite sports teams, every fact about them, some historical thing, love every fact about it. And they can be very good at specialized retail. Very, very good. A bank hired 2 of them to sell specialized financial products because they'll know every detail of every different product. There was a successful entrepreneur who sold business insurance, specialized business insurance. Car dealers selling cars. That's another one that's been very, very successful. They'll know every feature of every car on the lot. I call that specialized quiet retail. Now let's talk about some accommodations. I talked about accommodations with me when I was a little kid, but let's say for the grown-ups on the spectrum, pilots checklists. Any task that has a sequence of stuff you have to do, a verbal instruction doesn't work. Let me write it down, bullet points in a pilot's checklist format to show me how to close out the cash register at Walmart, for example. Because if you just tell me the steps, I don't remember them. I need an external working memory. Also, maybe the thing, let's say I worked at Walmart and you wanted me to shelf different stuff. Then I want to write down, I'm going to do the cosmetic aisle, and make a list. because lots of times they get fired and, well, they didn't follow the directions. Well, long strings of verbal instruction just do not work. That is an accommodation that is absolutely needed. And let's avoid the chaos, multitasking jobs, takeout window chaos, holiday chaos store. That's the sort of stuff that probably avoid. Those are two things that have come up. And then at the university, extra time on tests. But you see, what I've done so many of these talks, and I've talked to so many people that these accommodations I've just told you, they come up all the time. These are on the have to list.
And these things like visual supports or pilots checklists, and I love that term, these are evidence-based practices that we know work.
That's right.
What are some of the general challenges that you see people with autism facing in the workforce?
I'm sorry to interrupt. One of the things I have a problem with, I have a hard time figuring out when to break into the conversation. But I've heard some very sad stories of people that've had a job for maybe like 30 years, and then the company gets sold or shuts down, or they get a new boss. Getting a new boss is a dangerous time. In fact, I almost lost a job at one of my first jobs working for State Farm magazine when the magazine was sold and we got a new boss, and Jim thought I was weird. Fortunately, Susie, the lady who did the ad layout, says, Jim doesn't like you. We're going to need to make a big scrapbook of all your articles and show it to him. And then when he saw the work I did, he gave me a raise. See, part of the problem I had, why the new boss didn't know how much I had done, is that 3/4 of my stuff was not bylined. So he didn't know.
So you basically had to take your work and present it to him in a way that he could make sense of it.
Well, that's right. And that's how the way I sold the jobs, like here's one of my drawings right here. The way I sold jobs was to show people my drawings. That's how I sold the jobs.
And for listeners who can't see us right now, you're showing me an incredibly intricate drawing of one of your livestock handling facilities. Where'd you learn to draw like that?
Well, I worked for a while for a feedlot construction company. There was a wonderful draftsman named Davey, and I'm pretty sure he was on the spectrum. We were best buds. And I watched how he did it. Then I went out and I got the same pencils. But before I could learn to draw, I had to learn to read a drawing. And now you might realize how on a floor plan, a column that holds up the roof might be just shown as a round, a circle, or a square. I had to learn to see that. And I had a chance to take a set of drawings at the Swift beef plant, walk all around the plant, and relate everything on the drawing to the actual structure. You have to learn to see the structure when you look at the floor plan. And the best way to do that is walking around in the place.
Right.
And then the drawing, I learned the drawing really fast. I just pretended I was Davey. But there was a whole period of learning how to relate, especially the columns in a building, to the floor plan.
With so many inventions and with your designs now practically standard equipment in the livestock handling world, what are you proudest of?
Well, I worked on a piece of equipment called the center track restrainer system, and it's in all the big beef plants. I think that's doing pretty good for somebody they thought was stupid. And one of the things that really motivated me is I wanted to prove I wasn't stupid. I still can't do algebra. I can't do any higher math. That's why I majored in psychology. I had been tutored in statistics. But one of the things I did do is when I failed my first quiz, I asked for help.
What was it like working with Claire Danes and then seeing her on screen, playing the character of you? I could imagine it being sort of odd, something like an out-of-body experience.
Well, I worked with her for about 4 hours, and then I gave her all these ancient old VHS tapes, and she imitated my voice so good that when I was interviewed, they had the scenes for the movie played, and then her voice in the movie. I almost mixed this up between me talking and almost mixed this up. I thought they did a good job on it. And there's a new movie called An Open Door that's been made by John Barnard and John Festerman at CSU, but that concentrates more on my professor life later on in life.
So many people got to know your story through that film, and you've spent a lot of your life now in the public eye. When you think about your legacy, What's most important to you?
Well, I can tell you, handling of animals has gotten a whole lot better. That has really, really improved. I think I had something to do with that. But right now, at the age I'm at now, I want to help these kids that be different get out and get good jobs. And we need their skills. I mean, we better develop our math kids so we can develop the small circuits that don't eat up energy at a data center. And then you're going to need my kind of thinker to keep the infrastructure from falling apart, because it's falling apart. You see, you're going to need both. There's autism in both of those.
You're so committed to this mission of helping kids who are different, as you put it, find their place in the world. Looking back, can you point to people that instilled these types of values in you when you were younger?
Well, of course, let's start with my mother. She had the most profound impact on me when I was in elementary school. And then even when I had to go to a special school, she picked out 3 schools and she let me choose. There was always some choice. We can do this or we can do that. And then Anne out at the ranch, another really important mentor. My science teacher, Mr. Carlock. I was an unmotivated couldn't care less about studying. But then when Mr. Carlock showed me how being studying could lead to becoming a scientist, I turned that motivation around overnight. Now there was a reason to study. So that was Mr. Carlock, my mother, Anne, and then Jim, a contractor who seeked me out, showed me how to set up a business. The other thing I want to emphasize with these students that are different, neurodiverse students, expose them to lots of different things. When I was a kid, I was exposed to a little flute. I couldn't play it. Another kid's going to take off with music. I had piano lessons. I was terrible at it. But you expose kids to lots of things, find out what they're good at. But if they're not exposed to stuff, how can they find out what they're good at? Math kids need to be exposed to harder math. My kind of mind, I got interested in cattle as a teenager. Horses, that started as a teenager. Horses were basically, they saved my life as a teenager because they were one of the places where I had friends riding horses. Super important. But you've got to be exposed to horses to get interested in them. Expose them to lots. See, it takes exposure and then mentoring.
You're now 77, and it seems like you're busier than ever, teaching, writing, traveling months out of the year for conferences and speaking. Do you have any plans to slow down?
Well, I kind of, my back hurts. I've got quite a lot of pain. Every time my back hurts, I think about this 80-year-old flight attendant. She just wanted to get a fun job. And this was the Embraer jet, and the door has a big handle you push down like this. And I got upgraded to first class, and I got to watch her close the door on that plane and shove that handle down. 80-year-old flight attendant. So when my back hurts, I think about her. And I'm going, 80-year-old flight attendant, she put me to shame. You just keep going. You stop moving. I've talked to a lot of people. So you look like, my doctor said I was a young 77-year-old. And I've talked to a little bit. So people in their early 70s and barely walk. You got to keep moving.
When you were starting out, before your PhD, before your first inventions, did you ever have any idea that this is where life would take you and that your message would impact so many people?
No, I had no idea. I was starting out in little tiny projects. I started out with a little sign painting business when I was in high school, and the first sign I made for pay was for a hair salon, so I decorated it with the Breck shampoo lady. And then I remember like how much I cared about my little tiny branch projects I had. Yeah, it started out slowly, one little project at a time, then gradually get into bigger projects. And that's the same way these machine shops I worked with, the way they developed. They start out with small projects, and then a big factory hires them. They do a small project. They like them. Then they have them do a more complicated project. 15 years later, they're doing the Plan Edition. I've seen that. There's a scene in the HBO movie where I get the editor's card. That's a true scene. It's really true because I knew if I wrote for that magazine, it would help my career. I had the guts to go up and get the card. That scene's really important because working for that magazine really did help my career. And then I wrote for the state magazine, then I wrote stuff for the national cattle magazines. Yes, that made a big difference. That's seeing doors to opportunity. That's a very important scene in that movie, and it's absolutely real.
Temple Grandin, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you today.
All right, great to talk to you. I'm going to go visit some good friends tonight.
Well, safe travels and stay well.
Okay, thank you so much.
You've been listening to my conversation with Dr. Temple Grandin, a professor of animal science at Colorado State University. She has revolutionized the understanding of animal behavior and is one of the world's most influential voices on autism. Thanks for being with us. The Autism Annex podcast was developed by Star Autism Support. I'm John Andrew Slominski. In our next episode, I talk with Danny Combs, founder of TACT in Denver, Colorado. TACT, which stands for Teaching the Autism Community Trades, has taken Temple Grandin's message to heart and put it into practice. I hope you'll join us to learn more. Until next time, take good care of yourself and one another.